The howl that tore through Blackthorn Hall was not a sound of joy. It was a sound of ending. Elena Voss stood frozen in the center of the great stone floor, her white bonding dress catching the torchlight, as 300 wolves watched their alpha king turn his back on her. Damien Cross did not shout. He did not explain. He simply lifted his chin, looked past her as if she were smoke, and spoke the 4 words that would break her life in half. I reject you as mate. The hall went silent, except for the crackle of fire in the great hearth. Elena felt the bond between them snap like a cord pulled too tight, a physical pain that dropped her to one knee before she could stop herself. Around her, pack members shifted uncomfortably, some looking away out of pity, others watching with open curiosity, hungry for the scandal that would feed gossip for years. Elena had waited her whole life for this night. She had grown up hearing stories of the mate bond, how it was the rarest gift among wolves, how it marked 2 souls that fate itself had chosen to walk together. When she first caught Damien's scent 3 months earlier, when their eyes met across the border meeting between their 2 territories, she had felt something settle inside her, something that whispered, "This is him, this is the one." She had not known that Damien felt it too, and hated it. He stood above her now, tall and broad in his ceremonial black coat, his jaw tight, his eyes the color of storm clouds. To anyone who did not know him, he looked calm, but Elena, even in her pain, could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. He was not calm, he was afraid, and his fear had just cost her everything. "Damien," she whispered, using his name for the first time in front of his people, a small act of defiance. "Look at me." He did not look at her. His father, the old Alpha Marcus Cross, stepped forward from the raised platform where the pack elders sat. His face was carved from stone, unreadable, though a muscle ticked in his cheek. "The rejection has been spoken," he announced to the hall, his voice carrying the weight of law. "It cannot be undone. The girl is no longer bound to this pack." The girl, not Elena, not the woman who had traveled 2 days through wolf territory to stand here, who had trusted the stories, who had believed that fate did not make mistakes. In an instant, she had become nothing more than an inconvenience to be dismissed. Elena rose to her feet on legs that trembled, refusing to let them see her fall apart. She looked at Damien one last time, searching his face for any crack, any sign of the man who had once, weeks before, pulled her aside during a border negotiation and told her, quietly, that he had never met anyone who argued with him the way she did, and that he liked it. That man was gone. In his place stood a king protecting his throne. "You will regret this," she said, so softly that only he could hear it over the murmur of the crowd. "Not tonight, not next year, but someday, you will understand what you threw away." She turned before he could respond, gathered the ruined hem of her dress in one hand, and walked out of Blackthorn Hall with her head high, though her heart lay in pieces behind her on that cold stone floor. Outside, the night air hit her like a slap, sharp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. She did not stop walking until she reached the tree line, until the lights of the hall were nothing but a dim glow behind her. Only then did she let herself shift, her body folding into the smaller, faster shape of a silver wolf, and she ran. She ran until her lungs burned and her paws ached, past the border markers, past the last scent trail that still carried traces of Damien Cross, until she crossed into neutral territory where no pack claimed the land. She collapsed beneath an old oak tree as the sun began to rise, exhausted, hollow, and changed forever. Behind her, in Blackthorn Hall, Damien Cross remained standing exactly where he had been when she left, staring at the empty space where she used to stand. His sister, Wren, only 16 at the time, pushed through the crowd of elders and grabbed his arm. "What did you do?" she demanded, her young voice cracking with disbelief. "Damien, what did you just do?" He said nothing. He could not explain, not to her, not to anyone, that an hour before the ceremony, his father had pulled him into a private study and shown him something that had haunted the Cross family for 3 generations. A prophecy, written in faded ink on brittle parchment, warning that any alpha king of Blackthorn who let himself love his mate completely would lose his throne before his time, the same way his own mother had loved his father, and then betrayed him, tearing the pack apart from the inside. Damien had grown up watching that betrayal poison his father slowly, year after year, turning a strong king into a bitter, guarded man who trusted no one. Damien swore, long before he ever met Elena Voss, that he would never let a mate bond make him weak enough to be destroyed the same way. So when he felt the pull toward her, undeniable and overwhelming, he had panicked. And in his panic, he had chosen the throne over the girl who made his heart race for the first time in his life. She didn't do anything wrong, Ren said, tears in her eyes. She loved you. And you humiliated her in front of everyone. It's done, Damien said, his voice flat, hollow. It cannot be undone. Father said so himself. Then you'll have to live with it, Ren snapped, pulling away from him. I hope it was worth it. It was not worth it. Damien knew that even as he stood there, watching his father nod with grim approval, watching the pack elders murmur about duty and wisdom and the protection of the bloodline, he knew, in the deepest part of himself, that he had just made the greatest mistake of his life, and that no throne, no prophecy, no fear could ever fill the space Elena Voss had left behind. But pride is a stubborn thing, and kings are taught from birth never to show doubt. So Damien Cross straightened his shoulders, thanked the elders for their guidance, and walked back to his private chambers alone, carrying a silence inside him that would last for years. That night, he did not sleep. He stood at his window, looking out over the dark forest where Elena had disappeared, and felt, for the first time in his adult life, completely and utterly powerless. The bond was not truly broken, not in the way his father claimed. He could still feel a faint thread connecting him to her, stretched thin across the miles, aching whenever he paid it too much attention. He learned quickly to stop paying attention. He buried himself in the duties of ruling. He signed treaties with neighboring packs. He settled border disputes. He trained new warriors, and appointed new guards, and made himself into exactly the kind of king his father wanted. Cold, efficient, untouchable. Within a year, the pack stopped whispering about the rejected mate. Within 2 years, new mothers stopped telling their daughters the story, as a cautionary tale. Within 3 years, most of Blackthorn pack had almost forgotten that Elena Voss existed at all. Almost. Ren never forgot. She kept a small drawing Elena had once made for her, a sketch of wildflowers from the eastern meadow, tucked inside a book on her shelf. She never told her brother she still had it. She watched him grow more distant every year, watched him refuse every potential match the elders arranged, watched him build walls so high around himself that even she, his own sister, sometimes felt like a stranger in his presence. You could still find her, Ren said once, years later, during a quiet dinner, when their father was away at a diplomatic summit. You could apologize, ask her to come back. The bond doesn't work that way, Damien said, not looking up from his plate. Once rejected, it fades. There's nothing to come back to. That's not true, and you know it, Ren said. Mates can still bond again, if both choose it. You just don't want to try because you're afraid. Damien's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Ren was right, and they both knew it, but some truths are too heavy to speak aloud, so the conversation ended there, as it always did, in silence. 5 years passed this way. Damien ruled Blackthorn with a strength that earned him respect from every neighboring territory, a king known for his fairness in disputes and his ruthlessness against threats. He built alliances. He expanded the pack's protected lands. He became, in every outward way, everything a great alpha king should be. But at night, alone in his chambers, he still felt that thin, aching thread stretch somewhere far to the east, and he still could not bring himself to cut it completely, no matter how many times he told himself he should. Then, on an ordinary morning in late autumn, everything changed again. A messenger arrived at Blackthorn's border gate, breathless from running, carrying news from the eastern territories where a strange sickness had begun spreading through several packs. A wasting illness that drained wolves of their strength and left healers baffled. The messenger spoke of a young healer who had recently arrived in the region, someone whose skill with rare herbs and old remedies had already saved dozens of lives that other healers had given up on. "They say her name is Elena," the messenger said, catching his breath. "Elena Voss. She trained under the healers of the Silverwood Pack and has built quite a reputation. Some say she has already found a partial treatment for the wasting sickness." Damien, standing at the gate to receive the report, felt the world tilt slightly beneath his feet. Elena Voss. He had not heard that name spoken aloud in 5 years, not since the night he destroyed everything between them. He had told himself, over and over, that the ache he felt whenever he thought of her had faded, that time had done its work, that he was, finally, at peace with his choice. He realized, standing there in the cold morning air with the messenger still speaking about symptoms and treatments and border reports, that he had been lying to himself the entire time. "Where is she now?" he asked, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. The messenger blinked, startled by the intensity in the king's tone. "Last I heard, she was traveling toward the border clinic near Ashgrove, my king. Treating cases as she goes. Why do you ask?" Damien did not answer immediately. He looked out past the gate, toward the forest that stretched east, the same direction Elena had run 5 years ago, and felt that old, thin thread pull taut inside his chest for the first time in years. "Because," he said finally, "my sister has fallen ill with the same sickness, and I need every healer within reach who might be able to save her." It was true. Ren, now 21, had collapsed 3 days earlier during a hunting run, and the pack healers had confirmed his worst fear. The same wasting sickness that had claimed victims in the Eastern Territories had reached Blackthorn's borders. Damien had spent every waking hour since then searching for any healer skilled enough to help her, and now, impossibly, fate had placed the one healer who might actually succeed directly in his path. The one woman he had rejected, the one woman whose heart he had broken beyond repair. The one woman he was now going to have to face again, whether either of them wanted it or not. He called for his fastest riders that same afternoon and sent them east with a message, requesting, though it cost him more pride than he cared to admit, the aid of the healer known as Elena Voss for the survival of his sister, Ren Cross of Blackthorn Pack. He did not know if she would answer. Given what he had done to her, he would not have blamed her for refusing, for letting his message burn in some forgotten fire, for taking whatever quiet satisfaction she could from ignoring the king who had once discarded her in front of his entire pack. But 3 days later, a response arrived, short and formal, carrying none of the warmth he remembered from her voice. "I will come, not for you, for the sick who need help, and because no one, not even a king who wronged me, deserves to watch their sister die when it can be prevented." Damien read the words a dozen times, searching for something softer beneath the cold formality, and found nothing. She had built walls of her own in 5 years, walls as high and unyielding as his own. He told himself he deserved every inch of that coldness. He told himself he was prepared for it. He was not prepared for anything that happened next. 4 days later, as the autumn sun began to set behind the mountains, a lone rider approached Blackthorn's gate on a gray mare, wrapped in a traveling cloak, carrying a healer's satchel across her shoulder. The guards at the gate straightened at her arrival, recognizing the name on her travel papers before they recognized her face. Damien stood at the top of the stone steps leading into the main hall, waiting, his heart pounding harder than it had in 5 years of battles, treaties, and every difficult decision a king had to make. The rider dismounted smoothly, pulled back her hood, and looked up at him with eyes that held no warmth, no forgiveness, nothing of the girl who had once knelt on this very ground and begged him to look at her. Elena Voss had returned to Blackthorn, and she looked at Damien Cross the way a stranger looks at someone they have simply heard about in passing stories, distant, unaffected, entirely unmoved. It struck him harder than any rejection ever could, because he understood, in that single glance, that the woman standing before him was not the girl he had broken 5 years ago. She had rebuilt herself into someone new, someone strong, someone who no longer needed him at all. And somehow, impossibly, that realization hurt more than watching her walk away the first time. "Where is the patient?" Elena said, her voice steady and businesslike, already moving toward the hall without waiting for his answer. I don't have much time to waste on formalities, my king. The words landed like a blow, formal and distant. My king, instead of his name, a title, instead of the closeness they once shared. Damien followed her up the steps in silence, feeling, for the first time in years, entirely unsure of himself. Whatever he had expected from this reunion, it was not this. It was not a woman so composed, so unreachable, so completely beyond his ability to affect. He had spent 5 years telling himself the ache in his chest would eventually fade. Watching her walk through the doors of Blackthorn Hall once more, cold and certain, and utterly changed, Damien understood with sudden, terrible clarity that the ache was only just beginning. Elena kept her eyes forward as she walked through the halls of Blackthorn, refusing to let herself notice how little had changed. The same stone archways, the same tapestries depicting old battles, the same scent of cedar and smoke that had once felt like the promise of a home she would never have. She had prepared herself for this moment during the entire 4-day journey, rehearsing calm words, practicing a steady expression, reminding herself over and over that she was here as a healer and nothing more. What she had not prepared for was how much it would hurt to see him again. Damien looked older, though only 5 years had passed, harder around the eyes, more guarded in the way he carried himself. There was gray beginning to show faintly at his temples, and lines around his mouth that had not been there before. Kingship had cost him something, she could see that clearly, and some small foolish part of her wanted to ask if he had ever regretted the price. She crushed that thought the moment it surfaced. She had not traveled all this way to feel sympathy for the man who destroyed her in front of 300 witnesses. This way, Damien said, leading her down a corridor toward the private chambers where Ren was being kept. His voice was tight, controlled, and Elena noticed his hands clenched at his sides, the same nervous habit she remembered from years ago, though back then, it had usually meant he was hiding something he wanted to say. She did not ask what he was hiding now. It was not her business anymore. They reached a heavy wooden door guarded by 2 pack warriors, who stepped aside quickly at the sight of their king. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by a low fire and a single lamp beside the bed. Ren lay beneath heavy blankets, her skin pale, her breathing shallow and uneven, the unmistakable signs of the wasting sickness Elena had already treated in a dozen other patients across the Eastern Territories. But something about seeing Ren like this hit differently than the others had. Elena remembered a 16-year-old girl with bright eyes and an easy laugh, the only person at Blackthorn who had ever treated her with genuine warmth during her short time there 5 years ago. Ren had been the one who snuck her extra bread during long council meetings, who asked endless curious questions about healing herbs, who had hugged her tightly the night before the bonding ceremony, and whispered that she was so glad her brother had finally found someone. Seeing that same girl now, wasted thin and struggling to breathe, cracked something in Elena's careful composure. How long has she been like this? Elena asked, already crossing the room, already falling into the familiar rhythm of her work, checking pulse, examining eyes, noting the faint gray tinge beneath the skin that marked the sickness's progression. 3 days, Damien said from the doorway, his voice rougher than before. The pack healers have tried everything they know. Nothing has slowed it. Elena nodded, focused entirely on her patient now, grateful for the distraction of real work. The sickness responds to a combination of silverleaf root and crushed moonflower petals, but the timing matters greatly. Too early and it does nothing. Too late, and it can worsen the symptoms rapidly. She looked up at Damien for the first time since entering the room, and for a moment, professional distance slipped just slightly. How much time do you think we have? I don't know, Damien admitted, and something in his voice, some raw thread of fear, reminded Elena so strongly of the man she once loved that it startled her. The pack healers said, perhaps 2 more days before her body simply gives out. Elena turned back to Ren, already calculating dosages in her mind, already reaching for the satchel of herbs she carried. Then we don't have time to waste standing here talking. I need boiling water, a mortar and pestle, and privacy to work. Damien moved instantly, calling for servants, arranging everything she requested, with an efficiency that spoke to years of command, though Elena noticed he did not leave the room himself. He stood near the window instead, watching her work with an intensity that made her skin feel warm despite her best efforts to ignore it. For the next several hours, Elena lost herself entirely in the careful process of preparing the treatment, grinding herbs to precise consistency, measuring water temperature by feel, murmuring calculations under her breath the way her old teacher had taught her. It was work she knew intimately, work that gave her purpose, work that had, in many ways, saved her own life during the darkest months after leaving Blackthorn. When she finally had the mixture ready, she carefully lifted Ren's head and helped her drink the bitter tea in small, careful sips. Ren's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and glassy, but Elena thought she saw a flicker of recognition there. "Elena," Ren whispered, so faint it was barely audible, "you came back." "I came to help," Elena corrected gently, brushing damp hair back from Ren's forehead. "Rest now. The medicine needs time to work." Ren's eyes closed again, but her breathing seemed, perhaps, slightly steadier than before. Elena allowed herself a small breath of relief, though she knew better than to celebrate too early. The wasting sickness was unpredictable, and true improvement would not show for at least a full day. She turned to find Damien still watching her from across the room, his expression unreadable in the low firelight. "The next dose needs to be given in 6 hours," Elena said, keeping her voice carefully professional. "I will need to stay to monitor her progress, if that is acceptable to you, my king." "Of course," Damien said quickly, almost too quickly. "Stay as long as you need, whatever you require, it will be provided." Elena nodded and began cleaning her instruments, grateful for something to occupy her hands. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything neither of them was saying, until Damien finally spoke again. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for coming. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, after what I did." Elena's hands stilled over her instruments, but she did not look up. "I did not come for you," she said, echoing the words from her earlier message. "I came because your sister was kind to me once, when almost no one else in this pack was, and because a sickness that kills does not care about old grudges or broken promises. I will save her, because it is the right thing to do. That is the only reason." "I understand," Damien said, and something in his voice sounded almost defeated, though Elena refused to let herself soften toward it. "Still, thank you." She finished packing her satchel in silence, then moved to check on Ren one final time before allowing herself to rest. As she leaned over the bed, checking the girl's pulse, she felt Damien's eyes on her back, steady and unrelenting, and though she kept her expression perfectly composed, her heart betrayed her with a painful, familiar ache she had spent 5 years trying to bury. She had told herself, during every mile of the journey here, that she was fully healed, that time had done its work, that seeing Damien again would mean nothing more than seeing any other stranger who happened to share a difficult history with her. Standing in that dim room, feeling the weight of his gaze against her back, Elena understood with quiet, unwelcome certainty that she had been lying to herself the entire time. A servant arrived a short while later to show her to guest quarters, and Elena gathered her things gratefully, needing distance, needing space to rebuild the walls that had cracked slightly during those long hours of focused work. As she reached the door, Damien's voice stopped her. "Elena." She paused, hand on the doorframe, but did not turn fully around. "Yes. I know you have no reason to forgive me," he said, his voice low and careful, as though each word cost him something. "I am not asking you to. I only wanted you to know that not a single day has passed in 5 years where I did not regret what I did to you." Elena stood very still for a long moment, feeling old wounds and new resolve war within her chest. Finally, she spoke without turning to face him. "Regret does not undo humiliation, my king. It does not undo 5 years of rebuilding a life you shattered without a single explanation. Save your apologies. I am here for Ren, and when she is well, I will leave again, exactly as I did before." She walked out before he could respond, before she could see whatever expression crossed his face, before her own resolve had the chance to weaken any further. She made her way to the guest quarters in silence, and once alone, finally allowed the careful composure to crack, sitting on the edge of an unfamiliar bed with her face in her hands, breathing slowly until the threatening tears retreated. She had survived his rejection once, She would not let herself be foolish enough to open that wound again, no matter how many old feelings his nearness stirred back to life. Down the hall, Damien remained standing at Ren's bedside long after Elena had gone, watching his sister's chest rise and fall with steadier breath than she had managed in days, and feeling something inside him that he had not allowed himself to feel in 5 long years. Hope. Fragile, dangerous, and entirely unwelcome, given everything he had already lost. He did not know, standing there in the quiet dark, whether hope would be enough to fix what he had broken. But for the first time since the night he rejected her, he found himself wanting, desperately, to try. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with a light frost coating the stone courtyard outside Ren's window. Elena had barely slept, her mind circling endlessly between clinical calculations about dosages and unwelcome memories she thought she had buried long ago. She rose before dawn, dressed quickly, and made her way back to Ren's chambers, grateful for the early hour that meant she would not have to face Damien yet. Her relief lasted only until she opened the door and found him already there, sitting in a chair beside his sister's bed, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he had not slept at all. "You should rest," Elena said, before she could stop herself, old habits of care slipping through her careful professional walls. "I couldn't," Damien admitted, standing quickly as she entered, as though caught doing something he shouldn't. "I wanted to be here when she woke." Elena moved past him to check on Ren, relieved to find her patient's breathing steadier than the night before, her skin holding slightly more color. She checked pulse and temperature with practiced efficiency, allowing herself a small, genuine smile when the readings confirmed what she had hoped. "The medicine is working," she said. "Her fever has dropped, and her breathing has improved. If this trend continues, she should regain consciousness fully within the next few hours." Relief broke openly across Damien's face, years of careful control slipping for just a moment, to reveal the brother beneath the king. "Thank the stars," he murmured. "Thank you, Elena, truly." Elena busied herself preparing the next dose, uncomfortable with the raw gratitude in his voice, uncomfortable with how easily his relief still affected her own emotions despite everything. "She isn't fully recovered yet," she said, keeping her tone brisk. "The wasting sickness can relapse if not treated fully through its cycle. I'll need to stay at least another week to ensure the treatment holds." "Stay as long as you need," Damien said immediately. "Blackthorn's resources are yours to command." Elena nodded without responding further, focusing instead on measuring the next dose of medicine with careful precision. The silence between them stretched again, less hostile than the night before but no less complicated. Filled with unspoken history neither of them seemed ready to address directly. It was Ren, stirring weakly in her bed an hour later, who finally broke through the careful distance both of them had been maintaining. "Elena," Ren croaked, her eyes fluttering open, clearer now than they had been the previous evening. "Is that really you?" "It's really me," Elena said, moving quickly to her side, warmth breaking through her professional reserve at the sight of her patient waking clear-eyed and coherent. "How are you feeling?" "Weak," Ren admitted, attempting a small smile. "But better than dying, I think." Her eyes shifted between Elena and Damien, taking in the careful distance between them, the tension neither of them could fully hide. "You two are being very strange with each other." "Rest," Damien said quickly, clearly hoping to avoid the topic entirely. "You need your strength." But Ren, even weak and recovering, still possessed the same stubborn curiosity Elena remembered fondly from years before. "I've been sick for days. Not stupid," she said. "Something happened between the two of you last night, and this morning you're both acting like strangers pretending to be polite. What is going on?" Elena focused intently on organizing her herbs, avoiding eye contact with either sibling. Damien cleared his throat awkwardly, clearly unprepared for his sister's directness even in her weakened state. "Elena is here to help you recover," he said carefully. "Nothing more complicated than that." Ren's tired eyes narrowed slightly, unconvinced, but she was too exhausted to push further at the moment. "Fine," she said, settling back against her pillows. "But I remember everything, Damien. I remember exactly what happened 5 years ago, and I remember exactly how miserable you've been every single day since." Elena's hands stilled over her work, her heart betraying her with a sudden, painful lurch at Ren's words. Miserable every single day since. She refused to let herself examine what that admission meant, refused to let herself hope for anything beyond the professional duty that had brought her back to Blackthorn. "Rest now," she said instead, keeping her voice carefully even. "We can discuss everything else once you've regained your strength." Ren, exhausted despite her curiosity, drifted back into healing sleep within minutes, leaving Elena and Damien alone once more in charged, uncomfortable silence. "I apologize for my sister's bluntness," Damien said eventually, running a hand through his hair in a gesture Elena remembered achingly well. She has never learned the art of careful diplomacy. "She's honest," Elena said simply. "There's nothing to apologize for." Damien studied her for a long moment, something searching in his gaze that made Elena distinctly uncomfortable. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. Elena hesitated, then nodded once, curious despite her better judgment. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Wherever you've been these past 5 years, have you built a good life for yourself?" The question caught her off guard, more vulnerable than she expected from him, more genuinely curious than the polite formalities they had exchanged so far. Elena considered lying, considered giving him some easy, dismissive answer that would end the conversation quickly. Instead, something honest slipped out before she could stop it. "I've built a life I'm proud of," she said carefully. "I trained under excellent healers. I've helped save dozens of lives across several territories. I have earned respect on my own merit, without needing a title or a mate bond to define my worth." She paused, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since arriving. "Whether that means I'm happy is a more complicated question. But I'm no longer broken, if that's what you're asking. I rebuilt myself, Damien. Piece by piece, without any help from you." Something flickered across his face, pride and pain intertwined in a way Elena found unexpectedly moving despite herself. "I'm glad," he said quietly. "You deserve every bit of that success, more than I ever gave you credit for, back then." Elena studied him carefully, searching for the calculation, the political maneuvering she half expected from a king, known for his careful diplomacy. She found none, only genuine regret, weathered by years of quiet suffering he had clearly kept hidden from everyone around him. It would have been easier, she realized, if he had remained cold and distant, the same cruel stranger who rejected her 5 years ago. This version of Damien, humbled and honest, and clearly still affected by everything between them, was far more dangerous to the careful walls she had built around her heart. "I should check on my other supplies," she said abruptly, needing distance from the conversation before it went somewhere she wasn't prepared to follow. "Please send for me if Ren's condition changes." She left the room quickly, not waiting for his response, and made her way to the small workroom the servants had prepared for her herbal supplies. Once alone, she pressed her palms flat against the wooden table and breathed slowly, trying to steady the treacherous rhythm of her own heart. She had come to Blackthorn for one reason only: to save a young woman's life, using skills she had worked years to master. She could not, would not, allow old feelings for a man who had once discarded her without explanation to complicate that singular purpose. But as the days passed, that resolution proved far more difficult to maintain than Elena had anticipated. Over the following week, as Ren's health steadily improved under Elena's careful treatment, Elena found herself spending increasing amounts of time in Damien's presence, whether checking on his sister, coordinating with pack healers, or simply crossing paths in the halls of Blackthorn during her daily routines. Each interaction chipped away, slowly and persistently, at the careful professional distance she had worked so hard to maintain. She noticed things she wished she hadn't, the way Damien's guarded expression softened whenever he thought no one was watching him with his sister. The genuine care he showed toward pack members who came to him with problems, listening patiently, even to minor disputes that a lesser king might have dismissed. The quiet, steady strength he carried, tempered now with a humility that had clearly been earned through years of hard lessons. She told herself repeatedly that none of it mattered, that admiring the man he had become did not erase the pain of what he had done, that professional respect was not the same as forgiveness or renewed affection. She told herself this every single day, and every single day, it became slightly harder to believe. One evening, nearly a week into her stay, Elena found herself walking through Blackthorn's gardens after finishing her evening rounds, needing fresh air and space to clear her thoughts before retiring for the night. The garden was quiet and beautifully maintained, moonlight silvering the late autumn flowers still clinging to their final blooms before winter fully arrived. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she did not notice Damien until she nearly walked directly into him at a garden crossing, both of them stopping short in surprise. "I'm sorry," Elena said quickly, stepping back. "I didn't realize anyone else was out here." "I often walk here in the evenings," Damien said, something almost shy in his expression that seemed strange on a man who ruled an entire pack with unquestioned authority. "It helps me think. Would you mind if I walked with you? Just for a moment? There's something I've been wanting to say properly, and I think tonight might be the only chance I have, before Ren is fully recovered, and you return home." Elena hesitated, every instinct urging her toward the safety of distance, toward the guest chambers where she could retreat behind careful walls once more. But something in his voice, some genuine vulnerability she hadn't expected from the once untouchable Alpha King, made her pause. "All right," she said finally, against her own better judgment, but only for a moment. They walked in silence for several minutes, the only sound the crunch of frost beneath their feet and the distant call of night birds settling into the trees. Finally, Damien spoke, his voice low and careful, as though every word had been rehearsed 100 times before finally finding the courage to speak them aloud. "5 years ago, I made the worst mistake of my life," he said. "I let fear decide something that should have belonged entirely to my heart. I've spent every day since trying to understand how I could have been foolish enough to throw away something so rare, so precious, simply because I was afraid of what it might cost me." Elena's steps slowed, her heart pounding uncomfortably in her chest. "Damien, please," he said gently, "let me finish. I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight, or ever, if that's not something you're capable of giving. I only need you to know the truth, because you deserve that much, even if nothing else." Elena stopped walking entirely, turning to face him fully beneath the pale moonlight, bracing herself for whatever confession he was finally ready to share, after 5 long years of silence. Damien stood very still beneath the moonlight, his hands clasped behind his back in the formal posture Elena remembered from council meetings, though his eyes held none of that same detachment now. She could see the effort it took him to speak, the way old pride warred visibly with newfound honesty. "The night before our bonding ceremony," he began, "my father called me into his private study. He showed me a prophecy that has haunted the Cross family for 3 generations, written by a seer during my grandfather's time. It warned that any Alpha King of Blackthorn, who allowed himself to love his mate completely, would lose his throne before his time, exactly the way my own mother's love for my father eventually destroyed him from within." Elena's breath caught slightly, old confusion from 5 years ago finally beginning to find answers she had spent countless nights wondering about. "Your mother," she said carefully, remembering only vague whispered rumors about a scandal that had happened long before she ever arrived at Blackthorn. "I never knew the full story." "Few do," Damien said, his jaw tight with old pain. "My mother betrayed my father for another Alpha when I was young, nearly starting a war between packs that took years to fully repair. My father never recovered from that betrayal. He became exactly the kind of king I grew up watching, cold, guarded, trusting no one completely, not even his own children. He raised me to believe that a mate bond was a weakness, a vulnerability that could be exploited, or could destroy everything I was meant to protect. So when you felt the bond with me," Elena said slowly, pieces finally clicking into place after years of confusion, "you panicked. You believed loving me would eventually destroy your throne, the same way your mother's love destroyed your father's." "Yes," Damien admitted, shame heavy in his voice. "It was cowardice, plain and simple, though I told myself for years that it was wisdom, that I was protecting the pack by protecting myself from that same fate. I convinced myself that rejecting you was the responsible choice, the choice a good king would make." He paused, meeting her eyes directly despite the visible effort it cost him. "I was wrong. I have never been more wrong about anything in my entire life." Elena stood silently for a long moment, absorbing the weight of everything he had finally revealed. 5 years of confusion and pain, suddenly given context she had never expected to receive. Part of her wanted desperately to remain angry, to hold on to the righteous fury that had sustained her through the darkest months after leaving Blackthorn. But another part of her, the part that had once loved this man deeply before he broke her heart, felt something shift and soften, despite her best efforts to remain guarded. "That prophecy," she said finally, choosing her words with careful precision, "does it say specifically that love itself destroys a king, or does it simply describe what happened to your father, assuming that outcome would repeat itself with any future mate bond?" Damien blinked, clearly not expecting that particular question. "I don't understand the difference." "There's a significant difference," Elena said, old habits of careful logical thinking asserting themselves despite the emotional weight of the conversation. "Your father's downfall came from betrayal, not from love itself. Your mother chose to betray him. That was her choice, her failing, not an inevitable curse attached to every mate bond within your bloodline. You built your entire decision 5 years ago on a foundation that may not even be accurate." Damien stared at her, something like dawning realization slowly crossing his features. "I never considered it that way," he admitted quietly. "I was so afraid, so certain that history would simply repeat itself, that I never questioned whether the prophecy actually meant what my father claimed it meant." "Fear rarely allows for careful analysis," Elena said, though not unkindly. "I understand that better than you might think. I've spent 5 years learning to separate fear from wisdom in my own decisions, in my healing work, in every choice I've made rebuilding my life. It's a difficult skill to master." They stood together in silence for several long moments, the cold night air settling comfortably between them, despite everything unresolved still hanging in the space they shared. Finally, Damien spoke again, his voice quieter now, more hesitant. "I know I have no right to ask this," he said, "but is there any possibility, any chance at all, that you might consider forgiving me someday? Not tonight, not soon, but someday, if I proved through actions rather than words that I've truly changed?" Elena felt the question settle heavily in her chest, old wounds and cautious hope tangling together in ways she wasn't fully prepared to untangle. She thought of the 5 years she had spent rebuilding herself, brick by careful brick, into a woman who no longer needed anyone's approval to feel whole. She thought of the humiliation she had suffered in front of 300 witnesses, the pain that had nearly broken her before she found the strength to transform it into purpose instead. She thought, too, of the man standing before her now, humbled and honest, in ways she never expected from the proud king who had once rejected her so completely. "I don't know," she said finally, honestly. "I came here to save your sister's life, Damien, not to reopen wounds I worked incredibly hard to heal. I won't pretend that hearing your explanation doesn't change how I understand what happened. But understanding is not the same as forgiveness, and forgiveness is not the same as trust. You broke something in me that took years to rebuild. I'm not willing to risk that fragile healing simply because you finally decided, 5 years too late, to be honest with me." Damien nodded slowly, disappointment evident but not surprise, as though he had expected exactly this response, and steeled himself to accept it gracefully. "That's fair," he said, "more than fair. Given everything I put you through, I won't push you, Elena. I only wanted you to know the truth, and to know that whatever happens between us now, my regret has been real every single day since I made that mistake." "I believe you," Elena said, surprising herself with how genuinely she meant those words. "That doesn't erase what happened, but I believe your regret is real." They resumed walking slowly through the garden paths, the conversation naturally shifting towards safer topics. Ren's continued recovery, updates about the wasting sickness still affecting Eastern territories, careful professional matters that allowed both of them space to process everything that had just been shared between them. By the time they reached the edge of the garden where their paths would separate, Elena felt emotionally exhausted but strangely lighter, as though some heavy weight she had carried unknowingly for 5 years had finally found a place to rest. "Thank you," she said as they paused at the garden gate, "for finally telling me the truth. I've wondered for years what I did wrong. What flaw in myself caused you to reject me so completely? It helps, knowing the truth had nothing to do with any inadequacy on my part." "You were never inadequate," Damien said fiercely, something raw and protective flashing across his expression. "You were, and clearly still are, the most remarkable person I have ever known. My rejection was entirely my own failing, my own fear, never yours. Elena felt her carefully maintained composure waver dangerously at the intensity in his voice, old feelings stirring uncomfortably close to the surface despite every effort to keep them buried. "Good night, Damien," she said softly, needing distance before she said something she might regret. "Good night, Elena," he replied, watching her walk away with an expression she couldn't quite identify, though it looked remarkably like hope carefully restrained. Over the following days, Ren's recovery continued steadily, color returning fully to her cheeks, strength gradually rebuilding in muscles that had been wasted thin by illness. Elena adjusted the treatment regimen carefully as her patient improved, reducing dosages gradually, while monitoring closely for any signs of relapse. During this time, her interactions with Damien settled into something new, still careful and measured, but no longer defined by the cold formality that had characterized their first days together. They found themselves discussing pack matters, healing techniques, even old memories from before everything had gone wrong between them, conversations that felt achingly familiar despite 5 years of separation. Ren, recovering enough now to sit up and take notice of everything happening around her, watched these interactions with undisguised interest and satisfaction. "You two are falling for each other all over again," she announced one afternoon, catching both Elena and Damien off guard during what had been, until that moment, a perfectly professional discussion about post-recovery care. "Ren," Damien warned, color rising slightly in his cheeks. "What? I'm simply stating what I observe," Ren said, entirely unrepentant despite her brother's warning tone. "You light up whenever she enters a room, Damien. You always have, even 5 years ago, even when you were being an absolute fool about the whole situation. And Elena," she said, turning her attention pointedly toward the healer, "you've been smiling more this past week than I've ever seen from you, even during your first visit before everything fell apart." Elena felt heat rise in her own cheeks, caught off guard by Ren's blunt observation. "I'm simply focused on your recovery," she said, though the protest sounded weak even to her own ears. "Of course you are," Ren said, entirely unconvinced, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "That's exactly why you two spent an hour walking through the gardens together 3 nights ago, purely for professional reasons." Neither Elena nor Damien had an adequate response to that particular observation, and the conversation moved awkwardly toward safer topics, though the tension between them, complicated and unresolved, lingered in the air long after Ren finally drifted off to sleep. Elena retreated to her workroom that evening, needing time alone to process everything happening around her, everything shifting inside her own heart despite every determined effort to remain guarded. She had come to Blackthorn prepared for cold distance, prepared to complete her duty, and leave again without any complications beyond professional satisfaction at a difficult case successfully treated. She had not prepared for this, for old feelings resurrecting themselves despite 5 years of careful healing, for a man's genuine transformation challenging every careful wall she had built around her heart. As she organized her remaining herbal supplies, calculating how many more days Ren's treatment would require before full recovery, Elena found herself facing an uncomfortable truth she had been avoiding since her very first night back at Blackthorn. She was not entirely certain, anymore, that she wanted to leave. The following morning brought unexpected visitors to Blackthorn's gates, delegates from the neighboring Ravenswood territory, arriving for a previously scheduled diplomatic meeting that Damien had nearly forgotten amid the chaos of his sister's illness. Among the delegation stood Alpha Cade Sorensen, a powerful young leader whose territory bordered Blackthorn's eastern reaches, known throughout the region for his ambition and his notoriously confident manner with everyone he encountered. Elena, making her way through the courtyard toward the herb garden for fresh supplies, found herself directly in the path of the arriving delegation, and Cade's attention immediately fixed upon her with obvious interest. "Well," he said, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard, drawing attention from several nearby pack members, "Blackthorn's healers have certainly improved in quality since my last visit here." Elena paused, offering a polite but reserved nod in acknowledgement. "I'm simply visiting to treat a patient," she said. "I'm not permanently attached to Blackthorn's pack." "Even better," Cade said, moving closer with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to admiration wherever he went. That means you're not bound by any obligations here. Might I ask your name? Elena Voss, she said, maintaining careful professional distance despite his obvious interest. Elena, Cade repeated, testing the name with evident approval. I've heard rumors of a remarkable healer traveling through the Eastern Territories, saving lives that other healers had given up as lost causes. I didn't expect to find her standing directly in Blackthorn's courtyard, and I certainly didn't expect her to be quite this beautiful. Elena felt heat rise uncomfortably in her cheeks, unused to such direct attention, though she quickly composed herself with practiced professionalism. Thank you for the kind words, Alpha Sorensen, but I really must continue with my duties. Please, he said, call me Cade, and surely your duties can wait long enough for a brief conversation. I would love to hear more about your work, perhaps over dinner during my stay here. Before Elena could formulate a polite refusal, Damien's voice cut sharply across the courtyard, carrying an authority that immediately drew every eye present. Cade, he said, approaching with measured steps that nonetheless radiated barely contained tension. I wasn't aware you had arrived already. Perhaps we should proceed directly to our scheduled meeting. Cade turned toward Damien with an easy smile that did nothing to mask the calculating gleam in his eyes. Damien, he said, extending a hand in greeting that Damien shook with visible reluctance. I was simply introducing myself to your rather remarkable guest here. I hadn't realized Blackthorn employed such talented healers. Elena is visiting temporarily to treat my sister, Damien said, his voice carefully controlled, despite the tension evident in his shoulders. She has important duties requiring her full attention. Of course, Cade said smoothly, though his gaze lingered on Elena a moment longer than strictly necessary. Perhaps once your duties here are complete, Elena, you might consider visiting Ravenswood territory. We could certainly use a healer of your evident talent, and I would personally ensure you were treated with all the respect and appreciation you deserve. Elena, uncomfortable with the pointed nature of the invitation and the obvious tension it was creating between the two alphas, offered a diplomatic but non-committal response. I appreciate the offer, Alpha Sorensen, but my plans beyond Blackthorn remain undecided for now. The offer stands whenever you're ready to consider it, Cade said, finally allowing Damien to guide him toward the hall for their scheduled meeting, though not before offering Elena one final lingering look that left her feeling distinctly unsettled. Once the delegation had disappeared into the hall, Elena allowed herself a moment to process the encounter, uncertain why Cade's obvious interest left her feeling more uncomfortable than flattered. She resumed her walk toward the herb garden, trying to push the strange interaction from her mind, though she couldn't quite shake the memory of Damien's visible tension throughout the entire exchange. She did not have to wonder long about the reason behind that tension. Later that evening, after the diplomatic meetings had concluded and the Ravenswood delegation had retired to their guest quarters for the night, Elena encountered Damien in the same garden path where they had shared their honest conversation days earlier. You seemed tense during Cade's arrival, she observed carefully, curious despite herself about what exactly had caused such visible discomfort in a king normally so composed during diplomatic interactions. Damien's jaw tightened slightly at the memory. Cade Sorensen has a reputation for pursuing whatever catches his interest, regardless of the complications involved, he said. I simply didn't appreciate his manner toward you. I'm perfectly capable of handling unwanted attention myself, Elena said, though something warm and unexpected stirred at the obvious protectiveness in his tone. I don't need you managing my interactions with other alphas, Damien. I know that, he said, running a frustrated hand through his hair. I know I have absolutely no right to feel anything about who pursues your interest, given everything I did 5 years ago. But watching him look at you that way, knowing what a poor decision I made when I had the chance to keep you here permanently, it was difficult to witness with any composure. Elena studied him carefully, torn between irritation at his presumption and unwilling sympathy for the genuine distress evident in his expression. You rejected any claim to feeling territorial about my interactions the moment you rejected our bond in front of your entire pack, she said, though not unkindly. I understand this is difficult for you, watching someone else express interest in me. But you gave up the right to jealousy 5 years ago. I know, Damien said quietly, accepting the rebuke without argument. I'm not trying to claim any right over your choices, Elena. I only wanted you to understand why my reaction was what it was. Old feelings don't disappear simply because circumstances change. They stood together in uncomfortable silence for several moments, the weight of unresolved history hanging heavily between them, until Elena finally spoke again, curious despite her better judgment. Would it matter to you, she asked carefully, if I did consider Cade's offer, if I decided to relocate to Ravenswood territory once Ren's treatment is complete? Damien's expression tightened visibly, old pain flashing briefly across his features before he composed himself with obvious effort. It would matter to me a great deal, he admitted quietly, though I recognize I have no right to ask you to consider my feelings when making that decision. You deserve to build whatever life brings you genuine happiness, wherever that might be. Elena felt something shift uncomfortably in her chest at his careful, generous response, recognizing the significant restraint it must have required for him to offer such genuine support, despite obvious personal pain. I haven't decided anything yet, she said finally, softening slightly despite her best efforts to maintain careful distance. My immediate focus remains entirely on completing Ren's treatment successfully. Everything beyond that remains uncertain. That's fair, Damien said, nodding with evident acceptance, despite the disappointment still visible in his expression. Whatever you decide, Elena, I hope you know that my support for your happiness is genuine, even if that happiness ultimately takes you far from Blackthorn. The conversation shifted toward safer topics after that, but Elena found herself unable to fully dismiss the exchange from her thoughts over the following days. She noticed, with growing discomfort, how carefully she now considered every interaction with Cade during his continued diplomatic visit, how she found herself comparing his confident, practiced charm unfavorably against Damien's genuine, hard-won humility. She noticed, too, how her heart reacted with unmistakable warmth whenever Damien entered a room, how she found herself anticipating their evening garden walks with an eagerness she couldn't quite explain away as simple professional courtesy. Nearly 2 weeks after her arrival at Blackthorn, with Ren now fully recovered and requiring only minimal ongoing monitoring, Elena found herself facing an increasingly urgent decision about her future. Her work here was nearly complete. She could return to her established healing practice in the Eastern Territories, continue building the independent life she had worked so hard to create. Or she could consider, however cautiously, whether there remained any possibility of rebuilding something meaningful with the man who had once broken her heart so completely. The decision felt impossibly complicated, tangled with old pain, new hope, and a genuine uncertainty about whether trust, once so thoroughly shattered, could ever be fully rebuilt. That evening, during what both of them had silently acknowledged as likely one of their final garden walks before Elena's departure, Damien finally addressed the question hanging unspoken between them for days. Ren is fully recovered, he said quietly, as they walked slowly along the familiar garden path. Your work here is complete. I imagine you'll be leaving soon. Within the next few days, Elena confirmed, feeling an unexpected ache at the thought despite months, years even, of telling herself she never wanted to return to Blackthorn again. Damien nodded slowly, accepting this with evident difficulty. I won't pretend the thought of you leaving doesn't cause me significant pain, he said, but I understand it's not my place to ask you to stay, not after everything that happened between us. Elena stopped walking, turning to face him fully in the moonlight, something in his careful restraint finally breaking through her own remaining defenses. What if, she said slowly, testing words she hadn't fully planned to speak aloud, I told you that leaving no longer feels like the certainty it once was. Damien's breath caught visibly, hope flaring cautiously in his expression, despite obvious effort to remain composed. Elena, I'm not saying I've forgiven you completely, she said quickly, needing to establish clear boundaries even as she allowed herself this small admission. I'm not saying I trust easily again, after everything that happened. But these past 2 weeks have shown me a different man than the one who rejected me 5 years ago. A man who has genuinely grown, genuinely changed. I find myself wondering, against my better judgment, whether there might be something worth rebuilding between us. Hope and caution warred visibly across Damien's expression as he processed her words carefully. What would that rebuilding look like? He he asked, if you were willing to consider it. Slowly, Elena said firmly. Carefully, with no guarantees and no expectations beyond what genuinely develops between us over time. I won't be rushed into anything, Damien, and I reserve the right to walk away again if trust isn't fully rebuilt. That's more than fair, Damien said, something like genuine wonder crossing his features. I would ask for nothing less than the careful pace you deserve. Whatever time you need, Elena, I'm willing to wait, willing to prove through consistent action rather than empty words that I've truly become someone worthy of a second chance. Elena felt something loosen in her chest at his careful, patient response, old walls cracking just slightly further despite years of careful reinforcement. Then perhaps, she said, allowing herself a small, genuine smile for the first time in the conversation, I'll extend my stay a while longer, purely to ensure Ren's continued recovery remains stable, of course. Of course, Damien said, matching her smile with obvious relief and carefully restrained joy. Purely for medical reasons. They resumed walking together through the moonlit garden, the space between them slightly narrower than before, old wounds beginning, tentatively and carefully, the long process of finally healing. The decision to stay longer at Blackthorn brought Elena an unfamiliar mixture of hope and anxiety that followed her through each new day. She told herself repeatedly that extending her visit was simply practical, ensuring Ren's full recovery before returning to her established practice in the East. But she knew, even as she constructed these careful justifications, that the real reason ran far deeper than professional obligation. She was choosing, carefully and against every instinct toward self-protection, to give Damien Cross the chance to prove himself worthy of trust rebuilt. It was not an easy choice, and the following weeks tested that decision repeatedly in ways Elena had not fully anticipated. Cade Sorensen, despite Damien's obvious discomfort, extended his diplomatic visit far longer than the original negotiations required, citing various minor concerns that conveniently kept him within Blackthorn's territory. His attention toward Elena, while never crossing into anything inappropriate, remained persistent and increasingly difficult to politely deflect. I simply don't understand your hesitation, Cade said one afternoon, finding Elena alone in the herb garden as she gathered supplies for Ren's final treatment doses. Ravenswood could offer you resources and recognition that Blackthorn, focused as it is on more traditional pack matters, simply cannot match. You would have your own dedicated healing facility, complete independence in your methods, and status equal to any pack elder. I appreciate the generous offer, Elena said, maintaining polite but firm boundaries despite his persistent interest. But my decisions about my future require more consideration than simple professional advancement, Alpha Sorensen. Cade, he corrected gently, moving slightly closer with practiced charm. And I understand there are complications here, given your history with Damien, but surely you can see that history offers little promise for a genuine future. The man rejected you publicly once already. What guarantee do you have that he wouldn't do so again, the moment his fear resurfaces? Elena felt an unexpected flash of protective anger at his casual dismissal of Damien's genuine growth, surprising herself with the intensity of her own reaction. You don't know him the way I've come to know him these past weeks, she said firmly. People are capable of genuine change, Cade, when they're willing to face their own failures honestly. Cade studied her carefully, something calculating flickering briefly behind his charming exterior. You've already decided to give him another chance, he observed, disappointment evident despite his continued composure. Very well, I won't press the matter further, though the offer remains open should circumstances ever change. He departed shortly after that conversation, his diplomatic business finally concluded, leaving Blackthorn territory with a final polite farewell that nonetheless carried an undertone of wounded pride. Elena felt relief at his departure, though the encounter left her with much to consider about her own feelings, about the genuine trust she was beginning, cautiously, to rebuild with Damien. She sought him out later that same evening, finding him in his private study, reviewing pack reports by lamplight, and found herself sharing the full details of her conversation with Cade without quite planning to do so. He's not wrong to point out the risk, Damien said quietly, once she had finished recounting the exchange, his expression troubled, despite his evident effort to remain composed. I did reject you once already. There's no guarantee, beyond my own word, that fear couldn't overcome me again someday. I know, Elena said honestly. That's precisely why I've been cautious about trusting this rebuilding process fully. Words alone aren't enough to guarantee anything, Damien. Then let me show you through action, Damien said, setting aside his reports with sudden determination. Come with me. There's something I want to do, something I should have done 5 years ago before ever allowing fear to make that terrible decision for me. Curious despite herself, Elena followed him through the quiet halls of Blackthorn until they reached his father's private study, a room she had never entered during her previous time at the Pack. Damien moved directly to a locked cabinet, retrieving an old key from his pocket, and withdrew a brittle, yellowed parchment that Elena immediately recognized as the source of so much pain between them. The prophecy, she said quietly. The prophecy, Damien confirmed, spreading the parchment carefully on his father's old desk. I want you to read it yourself, Elena. I want you to see exactly what convinced me to make the worst mistake of my life, and I want your honest assessment of whether my interpretation 5 years ago was accurate, or whether fear simply led me to the worst possible conclusion. Elena stepped closer, examining the faded script carefully, her healer's training in careful analysis and precise reading serving her well as she studied the ancient warning. The prophecy, written in formal, archaic language, spoke of an Alpha King whose complete devotion to his mate would eventually cost him his throne, describing imagery of betrayal, division, and eventual downfall that had clearly shaped generations of cross-family caution. But as Elena read more carefully, examining the actual language rather than the interpretation passed down through frightened generations, she noticed something Damien himself had apparently overlooked. Damien, she said slowly, pointing toward a specific passage near the prophecy's conclusion. Read this section carefully. It doesn't say that love itself causes the downfall. It says that a king who loves without wisdom, who allows devotion to override careful judgment entirely, risks losing everything he has built. That's an entirely different warning than what your father apparently taught you to believe. Damien leaned closer, reading the passage again with fresh eyes, understanding slowly dawning across his features. Love without wisdom, he repeated quietly, not love itself. A warning about balance, not a curse against feeling anything at all. Exactly, Elena said. Your mother's betrayal happened because your father, from what little I understand of the situation, allowed complete devotion to blind him to warning signs that a wiser king would have recognized and addressed. The prophecy isn't warning against love, Damien. It's warning against loving foolishly, without the wisdom to protect both your heart and your throne simultaneously. Damien stared at the ancient parchment for a long moment, years of inherited fear finally beginning to crack under the weight of genuine, careful analysis. I built my entire decision 5 years ago on a misunderstanding, he said quietly, disbelief evident in his voice. I destroyed everything between us based on my father's fear, not on the prophecy's actual meaning. It seems that way, Elena said gently, watching the profound realization settle across his features. I need to make this right, Damien said, determination hardening his expression despite the visible pain of recognizing such a costly, unnecessary mistake. Not just privately between us, Elena, but publicly, before the entire Pack. They witnessed my rejection 5 years ago. They deserve to witness my correction of that mistake, if you're willing to allow me that opportunity. Elena felt her heart race at the implication behind his words, old caution warring with genuine hope she hadn't allowed herself to fully embrace until this exact moment. What exactly are you proposing? She asked carefully. I want to call a formal Pack gathering, Damien said, his voice growing stronger with renewed purpose. I want to publicly renounce the fear-based interpretation that led to your rejection. I want to formally apologize before every witness who saw me hurt you so terribly. And if you're willing, Elena, if you can find it within yourself to consider it, after everything I've put you through, I want to ask you formally to consider rebonding with me, properly this time, built on wisdom and genuine commitment rather than fear. Elena felt tears threaten for the first time since arriving back at Blackthorn, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was proposing, by the genuine transformation evident in every word he spoke. That's a significant step, she said carefully, needing to maintain some measure of composure despite her racing heart. I need time to consider it properly, Damien. Public gestures don't erase 5 years of pain instantly, no matter how genuine the intention behind them. I understand completely, Damien said quickly. I'm not asking for an immediate answer, Elena. I'm simply telling you what I want, what I believe would properly honor both the mistake I made and the person you've become since then. Take whatever time you need to decide whether that's something you're willing to consider. Elena nodded slowly, her mind racing with implications she hadn't expected to face so directly during what she had assumed would remain a gradual, cautious rebuilding process. She excused herself shortly after, needing space and solitude to properly process everything that had just transpired. That night, alone in her guest chambers, Elena found herself staring at the ceiling, long after the candles had burned low, turning over every possibility in her mind. She thought of the 5 years of careful rebuilding she had accomplished on her own, the independent life and reputation she had earned entirely through her own strength and skill. She thought of the pain that still lingered, however faded, from that terrible night of public rejection. But she thought, too, of the man Damien had become, humbled and honest, willing to publicly acknowledge his own failures rather than hide behind pride and position. She thought of his genuine care for his sister, his thoughtful consideration of her own feelings throughout their careful rebuilding process, the way he had actively sought understanding rather than simply asking for forgiveness without earning it first. By the time exhaustion finally claimed her, Elena had not reached a final decision, but she had, for the first time since arriving back at Blackthorn, allowed herself to genuinely imagine a future where trust, once so thoroughly broken, might actually be fully and completely rebuilt. Morning arrived with unusual clarity for Elena, the kind of settled certainty that sometimes follows a night of difficult contemplation. She rose early, dressed carefully, and made her way toward the training grounds, where she knew Damien typically spent his early hours reviewing warrior formations before the pack's daily activities fully began. She found him exactly where she expected, standing at the edge of the training grounds watching younger pack members practice combat drills, his expression thoughtful and distant, in a way that suggested his mind remained occupied with the same weighty considerations that had kept her awake through much of the previous night. Damien, she called, approaching carefully across the frost-covered grass. He turned immediately, surprise and cautious hope evident in his expression at finding her there so early in the morning. "Elena," he said, "I didn't expect to see you until later." "I couldn't sleep properly," she admitted. "I've been thinking about everything you proposed last night, about the public gathering, about everything that would mean for both of us." "And?" Damien asked, careful hope tempering his voice despite obvious anxiety about her answer. "I want to say yes," Elena said carefully, watching relief and joy flash briefly across his features before she continued. "But I need you to understand something first. This cannot simply be about correcting a public mistake, Damien. This needs to be about genuinely rebuilding trust between us, slowly and carefully, with real actions backing every promise you make." "I understand completely," Damien said earnestly. "I'm not asking for instant forgiveness or immediate rebonding, Elena. I want to earn back your trust properly, through demonstrated actions over time. The public gathering isn't meant to rush that process. It's meant to correct the public record, to ensure the entire pack understands that my rejection was based on fear and misunderstanding rather than any failing on your part." Elena nodded slowly, appreciating the careful distinction he was drawing. "Then yes," she said, "I'm willing to be present for this public gathering, to allow you to correct the record before your pack. But I want it clearly understood, by everyone present, that this does not constitute an immediate rebonding. We are simply acknowledging the truth of what happened, and beginning, properly this time, a careful process of rebuilding trust." "That's more than fair," Damien said, gratitude evident in every word. "Thank you, Elena, truly." The gathering was called for 3 days later, allowing sufficient time for word to spread through Blackthorn's territory, and for pack members from outlying areas to travel back to the main hall for what promised to be a significant announcement. Elena spent those 3 days finishing Ren's treatment protocols, while also, somewhat nervously, preparing herself emotionally for standing once again before the same hall where she had once suffered such devastating public humiliation. Ren, fully recovered now, and eager to support both her brother and the healer who had saved her life, insisted on helping Elena prepare for the gathering, sharing stories about how deeply Damien had struggled during the 5 years of separation. "He never stopped thinking about you," Ren confided one afternoon, as they walked together through the same garden where Elena had shared so many careful conversations with Damien over the preceding weeks. "I watched him grow harder and more distant every single year, watched him refuse every potential match our father tried to arrange, watched him become someone I barely recognized sometimes. But underneath all that coldness, I always knew part of him was still hoping, somehow, that things might eventually be made right between you." "It wasn't easy for me either," Elena admitted, appreciating Ren's genuine warmth and honesty. "I spent years telling myself I had moved past everything, that I no longer cared what happened to Damien or to Blackthorn. But some part of me, I think, always knew that wasn't entirely true." "Fate has a way of bringing people back together when they're meant to be," Ren said with the confident certainty of someone who had witnessed genuine transformation firsthand. "I truly believe that, Elena. I believe you and my brother were always meant to find your way back to each other, even if it took a painful, roundabout path to get here." The morning of the gathering arrived with clear skies and crisp autumn air, the entire pack assembling in Blackthorn Hall exactly as they had 5 years earlier, though this time, Elena stood at the entrance with far more confidence than the nervous, hopeful young woman who had once walked this same path toward what she believed would be joyful bonding rather than devastating rejection. She wore, at Ren's insistence, a deep green dress that complemented her healer's status rather than any formal bonding attire. A deliberate choice meant to signal that today's gathering represented correction and acknowledgement rather than any premature rebonding ceremony. She walked into the hall with her head held high, meeting the curious stares of pack members who clearly remembered, even after 5 years, the dramatic events that had unfolded here previously. Damien stood at the raised platform, where his father had once announced the finality of her rejection, though this time his own father remained notably absent from the proceedings, having retired from active pack leadership the previous year to allow Damien full authority over Blackthorn's affairs. As Elena took her position near the platform, Damien raised his hands to call the assembled pack to attention, and the hall gradually fell silent with the same weighty anticipation that had characterized her previous, devastating visit to this exact space. "5 years ago," Damien began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "I stood in this exact place and made the worst mistake of my life. I rejected my true mate, Elena Voss, based on fear rather than wisdom, based on a misunderstanding of an ancient prophecy that I now recognize was never meant to warn against love itself, but only against loving without the careful wisdom necessary to protect both heart and duty simultaneously." Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd, surprise and curiosity evident on nearly every face as they absorbed this unexpected public confession from their normally reserved king. "I want to publicly acknowledge, before this entire pack," Damien continued, his voice growing stronger with evident conviction, "that Elena Voss did nothing wrong that terrible night. The failing was entirely my own, born of inherited fear rather than any genuine flaw in the woman who deserved far better treatment than I gave her. She has spent 5 years building a remarkable life through her own strength and skill, recently saving my own sister's life through her exceptional healing abilities, and she deserves this pack's full respect and admiration rather than the whispered pity or judgment that likely followed her departure 5 years ago." Elena felt tears threaten as she listened to Damien's public acknowledgement, the weight of years of silent humiliation finally beginning to lift under the genuine sincerity of his words. She glanced around the hall, noting expressions of surprise, respect, and genuine sympathy, replacing whatever curious judgment might have lingered from years past. "I am not asking this pack to witness an immediate rebonding today," Damien continued, glancing toward Elena with careful respect for the boundaries she had established. "Elena has generously agreed to consider rebuilding trust between us, slowly and carefully, based on demonstrated actions rather than empty promises. I am asking only that this pack witness my genuine acknowledgement of past wrongdoing and my commitment to earning back trust properly, however long that process might require. He turned then, addressing Elena directly, despite the presence of the entire assembled pack. "Elena Voss," he said, his voice softening slightly despite still carrying clearly through the silent hall. "I cannot undo the pain I caused 5 years ago, but I can commit, before every witness present today, to spending whatever time necessary, proving that I have genuinely learned from that terrible mistake. Whether or not you ultimately choose to rebuild our bond, you deserve this pack's respect and gratitude for your remarkable skill and character, fully and completely restored." The hall erupted into surprised murmurs, and, gradually, genuine applause, as pack members processed the significance of what they had just witnessed. Elena felt overwhelmed by the public acknowledgement, by the genuine respect evident in the faces surrounding her, by the profound relief of finally having her painful history properly and publicly corrected. She stepped forward, addressing the crowd with the same careful composure she had developed through years of independent healing work. "I appreciate Damien's honesty today," she said, her voice carrying clearly, despite the emotion evident beneath her careful words. "Rebuilding trust after such significant betrayal requires time and genuine demonstrated commitment, not simply public words, however sincere those words might be. I am willing to allow that process to unfold naturally, without any predetermined outcome or timeline. What happens between us going forward will be determined entirely by continued honest actions, not by today's public acknowledgement alone." The gathering concluded shortly after, pack members slowly dispersing, while continuing to discuss the remarkable events they had just witnessed. Elena found herself surrounded by well-wishers, pack members offering genuine apologies for whatever judgment they might have harbored years earlier, expressing admiration for the strength and dignity she had displayed throughout such a difficult public ordeal. Ren embraced her tightly, once the crowd had mostly dispersed, tears of genuine joy evident in her eyes. "That was even better than I hoped," she said. "You handled that with such grace, Elena. I'm so proud to call you my friend, regardless of whatever happens between you and my stubborn brother going forward." Elena laughed, genuine warmth breaking through the emotional intensity of the morning. "Thank you, Ren, for everything, for your friendship, both 5 years ago and now, and for your unwavering support throughout this entire complicated process." Later that evening, as the pack settled into their normal evening routines following the momentous gathering, Elena found herself once again walking through the familiar garden path, needing quiet space to process everything that had transpired throughout this remarkable day. She was not entirely surprised when Damien's footsteps eventually joined her own along the frost-covered path. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for allowing me that opportunity today, for standing beside me despite everything, even knowing it would mean facing that hall again after everything that happened there previously." "It needed to happen," Elena said simply, "for both of us, and for this entire pack. Some wounds require public acknowledgement before they can properly begin healing." They walked together in comfortable silence for several minutes, the weight of the day's events settling into something calmer, more hopeful than either of them had perhaps expected when the morning began. "Where do we go from here?" Damien asked finally, genuine uncertainty evident, despite the significant progress they had made throughout the preceding weeks. Elena considered the question carefully, drawing on the same thoughtful analysis that had guided her successful healing career throughout the past 5 years. "We continue exactly as we have been," she said finally, slowly, carefully, with genuine actions backing every word spoken between us. "I'm not ready to rush toward rebonding, Damien, regardless of today's powerful public gesture, but I am, for the first time since arriving back at Blackthorn, genuinely hopeful about where this careful process might eventually lead us." "That's more than I dared hope for," Damien said, genuine warmth and relief evident in his voice. "Whatever pace you need, Elena, I remain committed to earning back your trust properly, for however long that process requires." They continued walking together through the moonlit garden, the space between them narrowing gradually with each passing day, old wounds finally beginning the genuine, careful process of complete healing. 3 months passed following the public gathering, autumn giving way gradually to the deep cold of winter across Blackthorn's territory. Elena had extended her stay indefinitely, establishing a permanent healing practice within the pack's main hall, while continuing the careful, deliberate process of rebuilding genuine trust with Damien. Their relationship during these months developed slowly, marked by consistent small gestures rather than dramatic declarations, exactly as Elena had insisted from the beginning. Damien made time for regular conversations despite his demanding responsibilities as Alpha King, consulted her genuinely on important pact decisions rather than simply seeking her approval superficially, and consistently demonstrated the patience and humility that had first begun softening her careful defenses months earlier. Elena found herself, gradually and against every careful instinct toward self-protection, falling in love with the man Damien had become, someone entirely different from the fearful young Alpha who had rejected her 5 years earlier, yet somehow also achingly familiar in his fundamental character. She had not forgotten the pain of that initial rejection, would likely carry some faint trace of that wound for the remainder of her life, but she had learned, through months of careful observation and genuine interaction, that people were indeed capable of profound transformation when they possessed sufficient courage to confront their own failures honestly. The winter solstice approached with its traditional pack celebrations, and Elena found herself, almost without fully realizing the transition, deeply embedded in Blackthorn's daily rhythms and traditions. She had earned genuine respect throughout the pack for her healing skill and her evident personal strength, respect that extended well beyond her complicated history with their Alpha King. It was during the solstice celebration itself, held in the same great hall that had witnessed both her devastating rejection and her triumphant public vindication, that Damien finally approached the question both of them had been carefully circling for months. The hall was decorated beautifully for the occasion, evergreen branches and winter flowers adorning every surface, warm firelight casting the entire space in gentle, golden illumination. Pack members danced and celebrated throughout the evening, sharing food and stories in the comfortable camaraderie that Elena had grown to genuinely appreciate during her extended time within Blackthorn's community. Damien found her during a quiet moment near the edge of the celebrations, his expression carrying the same careful nervousness she remembered from their earliest conversations months earlier, though tempered now with genuine confidence, born from months of demonstrated commitment. "Elena," he said, drawing her gently toward a quieter corner of the hall, away from the main celebration, "might I speak with you privately for a moment?" She followed him curiously, noting the careful formality in his tone, despite the casual celebration surrounding them. "Of course," she said. "What's on your mind?" Damien took a steadying breath, and Elena watched with growing understanding as he withdrew something small from his pocket, a delicate silver pendant, shaped like intertwined wolves, clearly crafted with significant care and attention. "It's been 3 months since our public gathering," he said, his voice carrying genuine emotion, despite his evident effort to remain composed. 3 months of trying, every single day, to demonstrate through consistent action, rather than empty words, that I've truly become someone worthy of your trust. I'm not asking tonight for immediate rebonding, Elena. I understand that decision, when you're ready to make it, deserves its own proper time and consideration." He extended the pendant toward her carefully, his hands, Elena noticed with quiet tenderness, trembling slightly despite his obvious effort to remain steady. "This pendant represents something different," he continued. "It's a symbol, not of the mate bond itself, but of my personal commitment to you, regardless of when or whether you eventually choose to fully rebond with me. I want you to have something tangible representing that promise, something you can hold on to as evidence of genuine commitment rather than simply trusting my words alone." Elena felt tears gather unexpectedly at the thoughtful gesture, so different from the grand, empty promises she might have feared from someone less genuinely transformed. She accepted the pendant carefully, examining the delicate craftsmanship with evident appreciation. "Damien," she said softly, "this is beautiful." "Thank you." "There's something else," he said, his voice growing more hesitant despite his obvious determination to continue. "I know you established careful boundaries about pacing this rebuilding process, and I have genuinely tried to respect that pacing throughout these past months. But I find myself needing to ask, directly and honestly, whether you believe there might eventually be a place for me to properly ask the question I've been longing to ask since the moment you first returned to Blackthorn." Elena felt her heart race, understanding exactly what question he was carefully circling without quite asking directly. She considered her response carefully, drawing on months of genuine observation and careful consideration about her own feelings throughout this extended, deliberate healing process. "I think," she said slowly, watching hope and careful restraint war visibly across his expression, "that we've built something genuine over these past 3 months, Damien. Something built on honest communication, demonstrated trust, and mutual respect rather than simply fate or obligation. I believe that foundation is strong enough now to consider what comes next." Hope flared visibly in Damien's expression, though he remained carefully composed, clearly waiting for her to continue, rather than presuming too much from her careful words. "What does that mean exactly?" he asked gently. "It means," Elena said, allowing herself a genuine, warm smile that had become increasingly natural throughout their months of careful rebuilding, "that I think I'm finally ready to properly discuss what rebonding might look like between us. Not tonight, necessarily, during the middle of a celebration. But soon, Damien, I believe we're finally ready for that conversation." The joy that broke across Damien's features was unlike anything Elena had witnessed from him throughout their entire complicated history together, genuine and unguarded, in a way that spoke to profound relief and overwhelming happiness combined. "Elena," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that means more to me than I can properly express." "I know," Elena said softly, reaching out to gently take his hand, a small but significant gesture, given how carefully she had maintained physical distance throughout most of their rebuilding process. "I feel it too, Damien. This has been a long, difficult journey for both of us, but I genuinely believe we've arrived somewhere worth celebrating." They stood together quietly for several long moments, the warmth of the celebration continuing around them, while they shared this private, significant moment of genuine reconciliation. Finally, Damien spoke again, his voice carrying careful hope, despite obvious effort to maintain appropriate restraint. "When you're ready," he said, "properly ready, I would be honored beyond measure to formally ask you to consider rebonding with me. Not simply restoring what was broken 5 years ago, but building something entirely new between us, founded on everything we've learned and rebuilt together throughout these past months." "I would like that very much," Elena said, genuine happiness evident throughout her entire expression, for the first time since her initial devastating rejection so many years earlier. "Give me until spring, Damien. Let the full cycle of seasons pass since my return, ensuring we've genuinely tested this rebuilding process through every circumstance, rather than simply the comfortable warmth of these recent months. If our foundation remains strong through winter's difficulties, as well as summer's ease, I believe we'll both know with genuine certainty that we're ready for whatever comes next." "Spring," Damien repeated, genuine anticipation evident in his voice, despite the several months of continued patience the timeline would require. "I can wait for spring, Elena. I would wait far longer than that, if it meant eventually building a genuine, lasting future together." They returned to the celebration together after that quiet, significant conversation, and Elena found herself dancing with genuine joy for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, surrounded by a pack that had witnessed both her deepest humiliation and her remarkable, hard-won triumph. The silver pendant rested warm against her skin throughout the remainder of the evening, a tangible symbol of promises being carefully, deliberately kept. As winter deepened across Blackthorn's territory in the weeks that followed, Elena and Damien continued their careful rebuilding process with renewed purpose and clarity, both of them now working consciously toward the eventual spring conversation they had agreed upon during the solstice celebration. Their relationship deepened steadily during these months, weathering the genuine difficulties that winter inevitably brought to pack life, disputes requiring careful mediation, resource shortages demanding creative solutions, the ordinary challenges of daily life that tested character far more thoroughly than any grand romantic gesture ever could. Through every difficulty, Damien demonstrated the same consistent patience, wisdom, and genuine care that had gradually rebuilt Elena's trust throughout the preceding months. And through every challenge, Elena found her own feelings deepening correspondingly, old caution gradually giving way to genuine confidence that the foundation they were building together could indeed withstand whatever future difficulties might eventually arise. By the time the first signs of spring began appearing across Blackthorn's territory, delicate green shoots pushing through the last remnants of winter snow, Elena knew with complete certainty that she was ready for the conversation both of them had been patiently anticipating throughout the entire long winter season. Spring arrived across Blackthorn's territory with gentle warmth and the first delicate blooms pushing through soil that had remained frozen throughout the long winter months. Elena stood in the same garden where she had shared so many significant conversations with Damien over the preceding months, watching new growth emerge with the same patient determination that had characterized her own careful journey toward renewed trust and genuine love. She had spent the final weeks of winter reflecting deeply on everything that had transpired since her return to Blackthorn nearly 7 months earlier. She thought of the devastating rejection that had once shattered her completely, of the 5 years spent rebuilding herself into someone strong and independent, of the unexpected return that had brought her face to face with a man transformed by genuine remorse and hard-won wisdom. She thought, too, of every careful conversation, every consistent demonstration of patience and respect, every small gesture that had gradually rebuilt trust she once believed permanently broken beyond repair. Damien had proven himself, through months of consistent action rather than empty promises, to be genuinely worthy of the second chance she had cautiously extended. She was ready, finally and completely, to move forward. Elena found Damien later that same afternoon in his private study, reviewing pack reports with the same diligent attention he brought to every responsibility of his position. He looked up as she entered, warmth and gentle curiosity evident in his expression at her unexpected visit. "Elena," he said, setting aside his reports immediately. "This is a pleasant surprise. Is everything well?" "Everything is wonderful," she said, allowing herself a genuine, radiant smile that had become increasingly natural throughout their months together. "I believe spring has finally arrived, Damien." Fully and completely. Understanding dawned slowly across his features as he recognized the significance behind her carefully chosen words. "Elena," he said, rising from his desk with evident emotion. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying," she interrupted gently, moving closer with quiet confidence, "that I believe we're ready now. Ready to properly discuss what comes next between us, exactly as we agreed during the winter solstice celebration." Joy broke across Damien's expression with unguarded intensity, months of careful, patient waiting finally reaching their culmination. "May I ask you properly then," he said, his voice thick with genuine emotion. "Elena Voss, would you consider allowing me to properly court you toward eventual rebonding, built on everything we've genuinely rebuilt together these past months, rather than simply the fate that originally brought us together?" Elena felt tears of genuine happiness gather as she absorbed the significance of his careful, deliberate question, so different from the presumptuous entitlement that had once characterized their initial, doomed bonding attempt years earlier. "Yes," she said simply, genuine joy evident throughout her entire being. "Yes, Damien, I would be honored to allow that." What followed was not an immediate rebonding ceremony, but rather the beginning of a proper, carefully considered courtship that both of them had insisted upon throughout their months of rebuilding. A deliberate choice to ensure their eventual bond would be built entirely on genuine choice and demonstrated commitment, rather than simply the involuntary pull of fate. Over the following weeks, Damien courted Elena with the same careful patience and genuine respect that had characterized their entire rebuilding process. Thoughtful gestures replacing grand declarations, consistent presence replacing empty promises. He consulted her genuinely on important pack matters, valued her independent healing practice rather than expecting her to abandon it for more traditional expectations, and demonstrated throughout every interaction the genuine partnership he envisioned building between them. Ren, delighted beyond measure at witnessing her brother's genuine transformation and Elena's corresponding happiness, threw herself enthusiastically into helping plan what would eventually become their proper rebonding ceremony, insisting that this second attempt deserved every bit of celebration that had been so devastatingly absent during their first, disastrous attempt years earlier. "This time," Ren declared during one enthusiastic planning session, "everything will be exactly as it should have been from the very beginning. No fear, no hidden prophecies, no last-minute panic, just genuine love, properly celebrated before this entire pack." Elena found herself deeply moved by Ren's continued devotion throughout this entire process, grateful for the genuine friendship that had developed between them since her initial return to Blackthorn. "Thank you," she said sincerely, "for believing in this, in us, even during the most difficult early days when trust seemed nearly impossible to rebuild." "I always believed," Ren said firmly, "some bonds are simply too strong, too genuinely meant to be, for even the worst mistakes to permanently destroy them. I knew, deep down, that you and Damien would eventually find your way back to each other properly." The proper rebonding ceremony was scheduled for the height of spring, when Blackthorn's territory would be fully alive with new growth and renewed possibility, symbolically appropriate for the genuine new beginning both Elena and Damien had worked so carefully to build together. Unlike their first rushed attempt years earlier, this ceremony would incorporate elements specifically designed to honor everything they had learned throughout their difficult journey, acknowledgement of past mistakes alongside genuine celebration of hard-won wisdom and renewed commitment. As the appointed day finally arrived, Elena found herself once again standing at the entrance to Blackthorn Hall, though this time her heart carried none of the anxious uncertainty that had characterized her first, devastating visit to this same threshold. She wore a gown of deep blue, chosen specifically to represent renewal and depth, rather than the traditional white that had once symbolized hope so cruelly disappointed. The hall itself had been transformed for the occasion, spring flowers adorning every surface, alongside evergreen branches that had witnessed both her original devastation and her eventual triumphant return. Pack members from across Blackthorn's entire territory had gathered to witness this significant occasion, many of them the same witnesses who had observed her original humiliation 5 years earlier, now gathered instead to celebrate genuine, hard-won love finally properly recognized. Damien waited for her at the head of the hall, dressed in formal ceremonial attire that nonetheless carried none of the cold, guarded distance that had characterized their first attempted bonding. His expression, as Elena walked slowly toward him through the assembled crowd, carried genuine, unguarded joy and profound gratitude for the second chance he had worked so diligently to earn. When she finally reached him, standing exactly where their original bond had been so devastatingly rejected years earlier, Damien took both her hands in his own, his voice carrying clearly through the silent, expectant hall. "5 years ago," he said, "I stood in this exact place and chose fear over love, duty over genuine connection, inherited misunderstanding over careful wisdom. Today, I stand here again, having spent months proving through consistent action, rather than empty words, that I have genuinely learned from that devastating mistake." He paused, meeting Elena's eyes with unguarded emotion evident throughout his entire expression. "Elena Voss, you are the most remarkable person I have ever known. Your strength, rebuilding yourself entirely through your own determination after I broke you so completely, inspires me every single day. Your wisdom, helping me understand a prophecy I had misunderstood for my entire life, saved not only my sister's life, but our entire future together. And your capacity for genuine forgiveness, extending trust to someone who once devastated you so thoroughly, demonstrates a generosity of spirit I will spend the remainder of my life striving to properly deserve." Elena felt tears flow freely now, genuine happiness overwhelming any remaining trace of old pain or lingering doubt. "Damien Cross," she said, her own voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "5 years ago, you broke something in me that I believed might never properly heal. But through your genuine transformation, through months of consistent, demonstrated commitment, rather than simply empty promises, you have proven that people are indeed capable of profound change when they possess sufficient courage to confront their own failures honestly." She squeezed his hands gently, genuine warmth and certainty evident throughout her entire being. "I choose you, Damien, not because fate demands it, not because some ancient bond compels it, but because I have genuinely come to know and love the man you have become through this difficult, worthwhile journey. I am ready, fully and completely, to build our future together, properly this time." As their formal rebonding words were spoken before the entire assembled pack, Elena felt the same mate bond that had once been so cruelly severed, reforming between them, stronger now for having been genuinely tested and deliberately chosen, rather than simply accepted through unconsidered fate. The hall erupted into genuine celebration as pack members witnessed this remarkable, hard-won triumph, cheering and applauding with evident joy for the couple who had overcome such significant obstacles to finally arrive at this deserved, genuine happiness. Ren, watching from the front of the assembled crowd with tears of genuine joy streaming down her face, felt profound satisfaction at witnessing her brother's remarkable transformation fully and completely realized. The girl who had once secretly kept Elena's small drawing hidden away for 5 years now witnessed the true fulfillment of hope she had never fully abandoned, even during the darkest years of her brother's guarded isolation. As celebrations continued throughout Blackthorn Hall late into the spring evening, Elena found herself standing beside Damien, genuinely and completely happy for the first time since that devastating night 5 years earlier. She looked out over the assembled pack, witnessing genuine warmth and acceptance from people who had once, however unknowingly, witnessed her deepest humiliation. "We did it," she said softly, leaning slightly against Damien's steady presence beside her. "We actually did it." "We did," Damien agreed, genuine wonder and profound gratitude evident in his voice. "Though I suspect the truly difficult work of building our life together properly is really only just beginning. I'm ready for that work," Elena said with genuine confidence. "I've spent 5 years learning that difficult things, approached with patience and genuine wisdom, can ultimately lead somewhere worth every struggle required to reach it." Damien smiled, pulling her gently closer as their pack continued celebrating around them. "Then let's begin that work together," he said. "Properly this time, exactly as we always should have." As spring flowers bloomed throughout Blackthorn's territory and their pack celebrated late into the warm evening, Elena Voss and Damien Cross began their genuine, hard-won future together, built not on the involuntary pull of fate alone, but on the deliberate, courageous choice to love wisely, honestly, and completely, exactly as the ancient prophecy had always truly intended.